Hi, my name's Clark Miller, and I'm a professor in the School for the Future of Innovation in Society at Arizona State University. And in today's video, we're going to explore what are the elements of ways of knowing. So just to remind you, way of knowing, as I define it, the Dictionary of Clark, is the distinct social practices, processes, and methods through which a group creates, validates, communicates, and uses knowledge, right? So it's the different ways that different groups go about making knowledge, conceptualizing knowledge, using knowledge as they go about their activities in the world, right? So when we think about different ways of knowing, just some obvious ones, right? Science and scientific ways of knowing we all acknowledge are different than indigenous ways of knowing. Indigenous communities have very different notions of what counts as knowledge, why knowledge matters, how to think about and approach the design of knowledge and the work of knowledge making than scientists do. Right? History as a discipline approaches knowledge very differently from philosophy as a discipline does, right? So those are different ways of knowing. And then statistics, which is the collection of quantitative data about things that happen in the world or about the things of the world, right? So the census, for example, is a statistical count, right? It's a statistics project, right? We are counting people. We are counting up how many of them own their own homes versus rent their own homes. We're counting up their incomes. We're counting up the number of people who are in each location, each city, each county within the country, right? That's a statistical knowledge-making enterprise. Computational modeling, on the other hand, takes an equation and it simulates that equation, right? So the Earth's climate system is a complicated set of physical processes that link the atmosphere, the oceans, the vegetation on the planet in dynamic relationship to one another. And we can write equations that describe all of that. But it's so complex that we can't really fully understand those equations just as individual human beings. And so we program those equations into the computer and let the computer simulate the behavior of those equations under different kinds of conditions. Fundamentally different from going out in the world and counting things. Here we're modeling things. We've got a theory of what the equation is that describes a physical phenomena, and we're simulating the behavior of that equation, right? Different ways of knowing. So when we think about different ways of knowing, there are different elements to those different ways of knowing. And in future videos, we'll spend a lot of time thinking about different facets of this. But just to quickly go through those, let's start with what I call the structural elements of ways of knowing. And the first is epistemology. A philosopher would define epistemology as the how of how we know, right? It's what do we need to do in order to know something? So it's research methods, right? It's forms of evidence. It's styles of reasoning. By style of reasoning, I mean exactly what I was just describing in statistics versus computational modeling ways of knowing, right? One, statistics is a style of reasoning about the world by counting up the many things that exist in the world. It's a way of understanding populations, which I'll say something more about in a minute. Likewise, whereas computational modeling is a different style of reasoning about the world, right? We often think about quantitative social science versus qualitative social science as having different styles of reasoning about what's going on in the world. Forms of evidence, you know, history is really richly situated in historical facts. Historians want to go collect data on what has happened in the past. And so that means collecting documents, interviewing people who lived through different periods of time. They want direct historical evidence of what happened in the past, right? Whereas philosophers, yeah, what happened in the past is not a big deal for philosophers as a form of evidence, right? They're interested in theories and whether those theories can be advanced through processes of proof, through formal reasoning to generate statements that can be considered to be true in a philosophical sense, right? So epistemology is how we know, right? It's the methods and the processes and the ways of reasoning that we use to know things about the world within a particular way of knowing. Ontology, by contrast, is what we know about, right? So computational modeling really, it knows about things that you can model using equations. So it knows about fluid flows and fluid dynamics, for example, are a really good example of computational modeling. It knows about quantum processes and quantum mechanics, right? Whereas statistics knows about populations, right? So if you want to do a statistical study of humans, you do a census. If you want to do a statistical view of wolves, you do a census of the wolves, right? So statistics really tells us about populations. So ontology is about what we know about. It's the objects of our knowing. Then there's just the basic contents, right? The knowledge itself, the statements of fact and truth that are associated with a particular way of knowing, right? So any way of knowing comes with a bucket of knowledge that comes with it, a body of truths and facts that are associated with that way of knowing. And associated with those are a bunch of uncertainties, right? And those uncertainties include, you know, the kinds of uncertainties, right? So statistical ways of knowing come with particular ways of calculating and analyzing that data that give you certain kinds of uncertainties associated with them. And those are different than the kinds of uncertainties that come with computational modeling. The kinds of ways that a historian is uncertain about what happened in the past, maybe because in that particular time period, some group of people just didn't write anything down. So how would you know, right? It's that's a kind of gap, right? But that's different than the uncertainty associated with a mathematical proof in philosophy, right? So different kinds of uncertainties expressed differently, you know, and different ways of knowing also handle that uncertainty differently, right? So in some ways of knowing, it's incredibly important that you specify in detail and ideally mathematically the uncertainty associated with your knowledge, right? But in other ways of knowing, we hide uncertainties, right? And we try to keep people from seeing those uncertainty. Those are different ways, different aspects of different ways of knowing, right? How do you handle uncertainty? How do you manage uncertainty? How visible do you make uncertainty within your way of knowing? Standards and values, right? What we value when we're making knowledge, right? So let's go back to the census as a statistical way of knowing the US population. One of the debates we've been having in recent years is who should be counted in that population, that statistical population. So historically, what we've done, at least recently, is we've counted everybody, no matter how they got here. If they're living in the United States on a permanent or even a semi-permanent basis, right, on an ongoing basis, they're not just a visitor from some other country who's going home, but they're here, living here. We count them. But the Trump administration sought to change that. They believed that the census should only count US citizens. And so they have sought to change the way we count. That's a value statement. It's a value, right, about who should be counted when we statistically measure the US population, right? And it has different consequences if you count it this way versus you count it that way. You're going to get different numbers. The distribution of population across different parts of the United States is going to change. Some areas are going to have more relative population than others, depending on which way you count those two. But that value is embedded in the knowledge system. We talked about uncertainty a little bit earlier. You can say within a statistical test, we want 95% accuracy. That's a value statement. Why not 99% certainty? Why not 90% certainty, right? That choice of the level of certainty that you select is a value decision, and it's embedded in your way of knowing. And then finally, there are structures and flows, right? So the knowledge in the knowledge processes, the knowledge flows in certain kinds of ways from one group to another group to another group. Those in different ways that different people are involved, those are the structures and the flows of knowledge making within that way of knowing. And again, those can vary dramatically. So as an illustration, we have statistical agencies in the United States. Canada also has statistical agencies. In fact, Canada only has one statistical agency, Statistics Canada, whereas we have 66 different statistical agencies in different parts of the federal government. The Bureau of Economic Analysis, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the the Agricultural Research Service, ARS, right? All these different statistical agencies. Well, they have different structures and flows of knowledge depending on whether you have separate statistical agencies for each different part of the government or whether you have a single statistical agency like Statistics Canada that integrates over everything. Right? Impacts the way that knowledge gets made, how it flows, how it's organized, how knowledge making is organized. Right? So those are the structural elements of knowledge, of ways of knowing. And then we have functional elements of ways of knowing too. It's just a way of thinking about the different kinds of processes involved in ways of knowing. So generation within a way of knowing, how do we create knowledge in the first place? Validation. So once we've got a knowledge claim in a way of knowing, how do we review it for its veracity? Who gets to be involved in that process? Communication, right? Once we've got a knowledge claim, how do we share it? Who gets access to it? How does it circulate among various groups? And then finally, what do we do with that knowledge? How do we apply it? The application or the use of knowledge within a particular way of knowing. So those are the functional elements of ways of knowing. So overall, different ways of thinking about the elements of ways of knowing. And we'll use these different elements to help us think about different ways of doing knowledge management and knowledge analysis, different ways of knowing as we go forward. Thank you.